But it just takes this idea seriously that God is at work in our lives before we become Christians. And I don't think we take that seriously enough. And I know I'm seeing it because I'm looking for it, because it wasn't on my dim little radar screen. But, on Alpha at the moment, as you talk to people there, and that extraordinary sense they now have of this recognition of God's presence in their lives at key moments. And I think that's going on in every human being's life. Genesis 1 verse 2, the Holy Spirit hovers over the surface of the waters at creation. Yeah? I think he's doing that over every human being's life. And it doesn't just start when they suddenly show an interest in an Alpha course, which was almost my thinking. Maybe I'm just dim. They take seriously this idea of people of peace. Do you remember Jesus' strategy? People of peace are not peaceful people. They may actually be very disturbed people, but they're people in whom God is already at work and where there is a response, there is a connection between the person who brings the message and that person. And Jesus said, didn't he, when you find that person of peace, stay with them. I think what we've tended to do is, when we found a person of peace, we've got hold of them quick and got them in the church. That wasn't Jesus' strategy. Jesus said, stay with them. Why? Because they were the ones who unlocked a community. And one of the dangers, actually, is if we grab people and drag them into the church, is that we separate them from their community and potentially we lose the opportunity of the conversion of households and communities. Where are people gathering and experiencing community? Actually, this was at the heart. These first two are at the heart of Paul's missionary approach. Where were people gathering? He went to the synagogue or down by the river. He ended up in the Areopagus. Where are the people of peace? He goes and stays with them in the town. Actually, when you've asked these two questions, cafe church might be a solution. If it's a culture where people are gathering and experiencing community in coffee shops, then actually an appropriate form of church in that community might be cafe church. I'm not having a go at cafe church. What are the current existential issues? That means what are the issues of life that people are facing? Where are people expressing a longing for the divine? People are, but they're not expressing it in our language. People will talk to you about their guardian angel. Now, a few years ago, I'd have thought, or I'd have rapidly corrected their theology. Are they talking about the Holy Spirit, do you think? I think with some of them, let's not have generic answers. I think with some of them, as you listen, actually they are. But let's not be too quick to leap in with our theological framework. Let's listen, let's explore. It takes longer. They're on a journey which we should value. And I've learnt as much, if not more, from the folk on Alpha than I have from sat in any Bible study with Christians. And that's not to knock Christian Bible studies. That's to recognise that actually when you get amongst people with whom God is working, whether they're Christian or non-Christian, you learn things about him. And my understanding of God has just broadened the understanding of his grace through that. Another aspect of incarnation is powerlessness. Jesus embraced powerlessness. He laid aside his majesty. And actually an incarnational approach that happens on other people's turf means that we feel powerless. When it happens on our turf, we're in charge. When it happens in a different context, but actually then our dependence is upon God. What does the good news to these people, how does good news address the issues that they're facing? Very crudely, in the New Testament, Paul proclaims the Messiah to the Jews. It's good news to them. Well, it's kind of mixed news, isn't it? Good news, guys, the Messiah's come. Bad news, you killed him. But to the Gentiles, he doesn't proclaim Messiah, because it's pointless. He proclaims that Jesus is Lord, which is the good news, but it's a different side of it. Now, the difference with a missional incarnational approach is this, that only after you've asked all these questions, only after you're engaged in that community, do you then ask this question: what will church look like for this community? Our starting point is church. How can we change church so it's more attractive? What can we do that might attract more people? Can you see this is completely different? Can you? Completely different approach. Does it happen in the Bible? Well, it does. It's called the Acts of the Apostles. So you look to make disciples, and the consequence is the church. I heard Paul McConaughey speaking this week. Paul McConaughey, I'll introduce him to you later, leads a very large church in Sheffield. He said a very interesting thing. He said, we were commanded to make disciples, and Jesus said, I will build my church. And he said, sometimes we try and build the church when that's Jesus' job. Our job is to make disciples. Contextualization, there's a lot in these books about contextualization. Contextualization asks this question: what does the gospel look like in this context? Because the context within which you're in does not change the gospel, that is unchanged, but actually the way in which it's expressed is very different. And Paul is brilliant at this. Paul, in Athens, takes pagan poetry, in him we live and breathe and have our being, is not a Christian quote, is now. It comes from a pagan poem that Paul has read and knows, and he's thought, whoa, that's a way in to this community. Contextualization. His letters all contain allusions to the local characteristics of the town. This is a trick question. Where's that? You won't know. It's India. India. I mean, how daft is that? Could be any village church, doesn't it? And when you don't do the contextualization, what you do is you take a cultural form of Christianity and you put it in a different context. And so you end up in India with people dressed in Anglican robes singing from the English church hymnal. It's madness. Because actually, if the gospel is going to take root in an Indian culture, then it needs to find an Indian expression, doesn't it? And it's the same in our culture. We have a cultural form of church that actually is very different. Now, I'm going to put a quote on here now that 10 years ago I would have burnt, because I would have thought it was heretical. It's a quote from a Roman Catholic missionary, and his story, I have to explain his context for you to understand it. He was a missionary to the Masai Mara, okay, for a number of years, and he went to New York, and he was talking to church leaders about reaching teenagers, some of whom had been in church and some of whom hadn't. And it was into that context that he said this. He said this: do not try to call them back to where they were, which is their former experience of church, and do not try to call them to where you are. Beautiful as that place may seem to you, you must have the courage to go with them to a place that neither you nor they have been before. You see what he's saying? Actually, as you journey with these people, because they're coming, they're young people, they're coming from a completely different cultural setting. As you journey with them and share the gospel with them, what emerges, you will understand the good news better, and actually what emerges church-wise will be completely different to what you've experienced before. Do we find anything like that in the New Testament? I think the Apostle Paul would identify with it. Here is a Jew, and he ends up leading Gentile churches. The church in Antioch is so different from the church in Jerusalem because it's in an entirely different context. And in fact, as you look at the Gentile churches spread throughout that world, again, they appear to be different. Now, it's really difficult because we're not told their structures deliberately. We're told principles. And it looks like the church it looks like the church in Corinth probably consisted of a series of house churches. It's very interesting in Acts, and you can't build anything on this, but it's very interesting in Acts. There are two conversion stories. There's Lydia, isn't there, down by the river, and then there's the Philippian jailer. Never tells you that those two households formed one church. I'm not saying they didn't, but it's just interesting that he never draws your attention to that. The opposite of this is globalization. It's very interesting. When you go to the church in Bulgaria, they sing all the Hillsong songs in Bulgarian, which I thought was fantastic. And then I remembered, and I thought, and I'm not being critical, please, I'm just reflecting. I remembered on our first visit, after they were singing from Mission Praise in those days, and they jumped about 20 years in a year. It was quite interesting. But on that first visit, they said, we're now going to sing you a traditional Bulgarian hymn. And they stood up and they sang this hymn to us. And it broke your heart. There was something very deep. Because it was a Bulgarian hymn, it was the language of their heart. It wasn't an idea translated from somewhere else. It's very interesting, our Saturday night congregation, they sing a lot. They do sing some hill songs and others translated, but they also sing a lot of songs we don't know. And it's the language of their heart. Because you see, incarnation is the opposite of globalization. How does Eugene Peterson translate incarnation? He says this: Jesus, God, moved into the neighborhood. It's localization. It's God locally present. And in order to do that, you have to ask a question about what's the irreducible minimum of the church. And I'm not going to do this stuff, okay, because I've already gone on 10 minutes longer than I intended to at this stage. I'm sorry. But you have to ask the question, what's the irreducible minimum to be a church? Because Michael Frost says often he's a conference speaker, and at a meal afterwards, people will say to him, oh, we don't need to worry about Sunday mornings and all that kind of stuff. We're church here, aren't we? And he says, no. The question he asks, when is a bunch a church? He says, no, there's more to it than that. It's not just, well, I'll show you anyway. He says it's things like it's Trinitarian in theology. There's a covenant. There's an agreement. There's a commitment to one another. There's an understanding about the wider church, and above all, it's missional in intent. I'll tell you one story about incarnation. Oh, I was going to do contrasting. I'm sorry, there's just too much stuff here I've got. Tell you two stories. Church from scratch, that's Peter Domine. This is the church in Southend. They have a church weekend. I'm glad I didn't go on that. That would really frighten me, I tell you. Very basic. But they had a lady came. She was a hairdresser. She wasn't interested in going to the church, but she evangelized about the church to the people who came and had their hair cut. And there was a lady who said, oh, I might be. Anyway, she joined, a lady called Kathy. And Kathy lived on this estate. I can't remember the name of it. This is, some of you may not wish to, what was the name of the ballroom, of the dance centre in Southend? Thank you, the Curzon. Cool, you've had a checkered past, haven't you? The Curzon estate. The Curzon estate is a really grim place. So every Tuesday afternoon, Kathy, they used to pick her up and take her to one of their groups, you see. They extracted her from her community. This is supposed to be an incarnational church. Peter tells this story with great glee. They extracted her and took her to one of their groups. One day, Peter was taking her back one Tuesday afternoon, and he had a CD, worship CD on the car. And Kathy said to him, oh, we sing that song in our group. Peter thought, I've just been to your group, we don't sing. So what do you mean we sing that? Oh, well, we have a sing-up in, the group in the Curzon. The group in my flat. What group's this? Oh, well, all my neighbours come in. We have a sing and a pray and whatever. All right, okay. Could I come along? Well, I don't know when we're going to meet next time. Well, could we try and arrange something? Anyway, so he went along. But he said it was classic. We're taking this woman out. This woman was a person of peace. She was the key to that community. Now, it was a really, and interesting, Peter said, he said, when I first went in there, God said to me, shut up. Don't say anything. He said it was so difficult, and he said, so I went in and he said, I sat, he's quite a big bloke, he said, I sat on the floor so I would be invisible